that race is not a discrete thing, right? It's not either or. You can't really put it in separate categories. It's continuous and it's fluid. So by that, we mean it's also genetically open, that you have an inability to distinguish necessarily from one space to the other, and no race has exclusive possession of even any physical trait. In forensics, for example, one of the things I have to do is this assign race to an individual, and I use the word ancestor instead, it's a little more solid for me. But when we describe someone who has a skull that is mongoloid, the Asian or Native American, we talk about them having very flat faces, shovel-shaped incisors, and complex sutures. For example, Africans or people of African origins have jaw prognathysm, which means their jaw is a little bit further forward than the other two groups, and a lower, longer head, and that white people are basically shaped like a knife. Everything comes together in a point in the center of their face. Those are kind of the general rules. But if you're Vietnamese, you have the flat profile of the Asian right up until here. And then you have the lower profile of the African. So no group, and you could have complex sutures could show up in anybody, long low bolt could show up in anybody. So nobody owns one thing. Right, so the idea that one trait or any trait is specific to a specific group, exclusively theirs, is invalid. So here we are trying to link that genotype to phenotype. Now, if you were in my biological anthropology class, you'd already know what this means, but since you are not, those of you who have actually already taken that, just for a second you go to your happy place. But basically, a person's genotype are all the genes that they carry. You may not see those genes. When we see them, it's called a phenotype. Right? What's on the outside of the phenotype. What the actual book that forms your genetic code says, a lot of those exact words in the order they are is your genotype. So everybody carries genes for their eyes, genes for their skin color, genes for their hair color. But one of the things that's really important to know is that these genes are not Mendelian. Okay, sorry, never fancy word. They're not either or. So Mendelian traits, simple ones. How many of you can do this? Raise your hand. I mean, or kind of like that, right? Almost all of you. We know your genotype and your phenotype that you can do that because your genotype for rolling your tongue is UR, which means you've got 2 recessive genes for being able to roll your tongue that way. Notice that it was the majority of us. The actual allele for not being able to roll your tongue is in far lower levels, but one copy of it's enough. If you have one copy of that gene, you don't get to roll your tongue like that. That is Mendelian. There's no such thing as kind of rolling your tongue, kind of being able to do it. You can or you cannot. With phenotypes, and particularly with phenotypic genes, which are all the things you care about, hair color, eye color, face shape, all those things, they're coded for on multiple chromosomes. So we do have kinds. So, okay, how many shades of blonde are there? Natural shades of blonde. Many, right? How many natural shades of brown hair are there? Many, right? There's not just one kind of brown, one kind of blonde, one kind of brunette. That tells you that a bunch of genes are talking at the same time. They're all being listened to at the same time. If you think about eye color, now your driver's license makes it sound like it's discrete, right? In your driver's license, you have to write what color your eyes are, and you only have a few choices. You can have blue eyes, you can have green eyes, you can have hazel eyes, or you can have brown eyes. You don't get to choose. What happens if you're one of those people who has one of each? They make you pick one. They do. I think the hair color on your driver's license is hilarious. My last 4 driver's license pictures, my hair has been purple. It was also purple for my passport picture. What it says my hair color is brown. I would say of all the hair colors I've ever had in the world, brown actually didn't ever make it into the works. Like, I am red, I am purple, I am green, I am blue, I am blonde, I am red, I got hat red. Brown has never said to me, yes, Humpy Brown, right? But that's what it says because they treat it like it's discrete. So in eye color, they treat it like it's discrete. But you know perfectly well that some people have very light blue eyes if they have blue eyes, or dark blue eyes like an ocean. I have green eyes. My green eyes are like kind of like the inside of a lime. If you cut a line open. My dad looks like a husky, right? His are green, but it's just a ring is all that's left. Inside is almost gone. And part of the reason this is because these traits are also affected by the environment. So they're not even fixed traits. I have green eyes, yes. They will change. They will not always be the same quality of green, and because green eyes can be lime or olive or forest or all of these colors, we know that it's not discrete. It's continuous. We have to talk about it as values for a trait. So the things that we associate with as race are traits that have values that are not discrete, are not one category or another. When we describe our own race, we will often talk about it like you could have discrete categories. When you say to someone, I'm half this and half this, you are in fact subscribing to discrete categories. Remember our picture of our Japanese black friend? Right? He said, I'm half black and half Japanese. Right? And I asked him, of course, which half? Because that is, if you could be half this and a quarter this and 1/8 this, that suggests there's something that you've got pure blocks that you're taking apart and putting together. That you've got discrete blocks that you've just taken them and gone. That's not how it works. That's not how biological ancestry works. But we talk about it that way because we actually kind of have the DMV mentality of it. Close enough. All right, that's good enough. Well, when people ask you things like, now they started asking you your ethnicity, which I think is a more important question than your race. Where you're adapted to live is less important than how you see yourself, right? Because that's what they're trying to get at, really, is how you see yourself. What group do you identify with? But even still, they're often talking out of both sides of the mouth. Let us take the example of my husband. My husband is a UN of individuals. His father was Finnish, like from Finland. Tall, white, kind of just big, stocky Finnish dude. His mother, well, there's another story. So his mom's mom, let's go with his grandmother, was born in Tunisia. She was basically born around Morocco. And so she was born in Africa. That's where Morocco is in Africa. So she was born in Africa, but because she was Jewish, and it wasn't good to be Jewish at that point in that place, she had to run. So she ran to Spain, and from Spain she ran to Cuba. In Cuba, she met a man whose mom was Cuban, but dad was Puerto Rican. He identified as both Cuban and Puerto Rican. And then the two of them fled from there to New York. When they got to New York, they identified as Italian. I realized, and she just went, wait, how did you get to Italian? Well, Italian was the safe thing to be for the physiological features they had. They could explain a whole lot with being Italian. They moved into an Italian neighborhood and became Italian. Not Jewish, not African, not Cuban, not Puerto Rican, Italian. In fact, my husband's mother didn't know she wasn't Italian until she was like 15. by the way, his grandma can cook Italian food like nobody's business. It was like it was part of the deal. You have to be ethically Italian. You have to learn how to cook this food. Boy, can't she? Right. And she talks with her hands now and does all this stuff. She's a great woman. So his mom is made of all of these things. He is also made of all of these things, right? Because his mom contributes half of his DNA. So when we were filling out his, oh, and you might ask what he identifies as. And he identifies by whatever's convenient at the time. If you put him in a group of Hispanic peoples, he is suddenly so very Cubano. Right? And you should see him dance, right? His salsa is astounding. It's like he's got magic feet. His salsa beat starts, and the very first time, his hands drop to his waist, and suddenly his hips are going. I'm like, who taught you that? And he's like, I don't know, but it came with me. And you put him in a group of black kids, and he gets a little African on you all of a sudden. Not mid-African, not Southern Belt Africa, not West Coast, not East Coast, but North African, essentially Tunisian. He understands the culture and he's a part of it. It's a part of him. And then you put him in a group of white kids and suddenly he's white. Now, what does he look like? He could be anybody. I actually think that my husband's missing an opportunity to be a spy. Because he has everybody's features. He is absolutely forgettable. Truth be told, I met him over a dozen times before I remembered meeting him. Yeah, that was kind of yeah, lots of times. And he has an infinitely forgettable face. He has brown hair, brown eyes, not particularly light, not particularly dark skin. He's got medium skin. He's just a medium person. He's a little tall, he's 6'2". That's not out of range. He's just kind of a medium person. He has a brother, his brother is a spy. And I'm like, that's great, that is brilliant, right? Why aren't you a spy? His brother's a linguist and a spy. Like, I'm totally down. I've watched enough Chuck, we could be the best married spy couple ever. All right, but no, okay. So, when he started grad school, though, it was time to fill out that financial aid packet. And it said, check all that apply. So we did. He's like, the only thing I can't seem to check here is Asian of any kind. I'm like, yeah, but all the rest of them, you pretty much qualify because the Puerto Ricans are actually Native Americans. So just keep going, man, just keep going. So he checks all the boxes, and of course that sets up a flag of, hey, someone thinks they're everybody. And they called him into the financial aid office, and the lady says, you know, why did you, she looked at him and she decided on the spot by looking at him, he was white. And she said, why did you check all the boxes? You're not black. And he said, no, I'm African. And she goes, yeah, that means black. Just, hold on, you are aware that Africa's a large continent, right? That there is a South Africa and there's a North Africa. His African origins are within his household's memory. Like, it's a part of him. And yet, she was like, no, you can't check African American because you're not an African American. He says, you didn't ask me if I was black. You asked me if I was an African American, and I am. And she's like, you can't be. Right. And he said, no, my grandmother was born in Africa. Grandmother. If my grandmother was born in San Salvador, would I be Hispanic? Yes. My grandmother was born in Africa. Am I African? She says, no. Because you're not black. And he was just like, I'm in the twilight zone. What the hell, right? Like, how did this even happen? And it was because, really, what they were asking was not your ethnicity. What do you identify as? They were asking color. But they can't ask that anymore. So then you have to ask yourself, What? What the hell does that happen? Why not just ask me about my earwax? Like, it is equally as important to ask me about my earwax. Okay. So, what we're really, we see those forms and they say, check your ethnicity. I want you to ask this question. As students, please, going forward in the world, I want you to ask this question, why do you need to know? Now, if the reason they need to know this is because they're going to give you money based off of it, check all of the boxes, take all of the money. Absolutely do that. But if the reason they're doing it is so they can collect data about you, you can decide then whether or not you want them to do that if you know what the purpose is. But it's this continual asking and the way they set them up as boxes really keeps validating this stuff, which is not cool. Absolutely not cool. Because people make decisions about whether or not to give you money based on your genes. That's lame. So, oh, we already know all this. Okay, you're going to skip that. You can read that later. We're not going to talk about that. All right. So we start associating certain abilities and behaviors with these polygenic traits of which we can't even decide what the values are for those traits. So we say dumb things like we talked about on Monday. White men can't jump, or in my opinion, white men can't dance, right? I'm always fond of saying that, oh, sorry, you can't dance because you're white, right? Right. Or we say, in the time of slavery, we talk about Lincoln as the great emancipator, but part of his justification for emancipation was he believed that even if slaves were free, they wouldn't compete with white people because they didn't have the same intelligence. Nice guy, but a product of his time. So we know that none of that's true. Modern genetics can tell you that none of that's true, but we still make decisions about people based on that. All right, moving on. The way genes are expressed in are arbitrarily important. For us, it's skin color. Other places, it's economics. So classifications are never as simple as skin color. Again, obviously, look around this room. How do you decide who's white or brown? Because we can come in all of the shades, right? And classification by skin color is actually not that common across the world. It's very common in the Western world, but in other groups, it's classification, racial classification by parentage and economics is often the case. I have a friend who is he owns a taxi in the Dominican Republic, and the last time we visited, we both had a layover in Chicago, so we had lunch together. And he was so pissed when he arrived for lunch. And I was like, well, Jean-Paul, what's the matter? And he said, they called me black. They called me black when I came in. Don't they know who I am? And I said, well, yes, they know. I know what the problem is. The reason he was mad was because where he's from, black, is a function of economics. He's a taxi owner. He's wealthy. How dare they call him black? And I said, actually, they're referring to your skin color. And by the way, he is extraordinarily dark skinned. Like very, very, very dark skinned. And he was like, that's ridiculous. Why would somebody judge me on something that I can do nothing about? Why not judge me on my accomplishments? I was like, yeah, but why does it have to be race? And he was like, you people are stupid. I can't argue with that, sir. I can't argue with that. So, I'm going to show you a little film clip. And this happened in a town where all the kids were white, basically. And it was after the assassination of Martin Luther King. A teacher wanted kids to understand what discrimination is. And how do you do that in a class where it's entirely homogeneous, where everybody looks like everybody else? Well, she came up with a way. to show it to you. I'm only going to show you a few minutes of it, but it's kind of plastic. We actually, she came here and oh, and those kids, there's a whole video that's about those kids as adults. And some of them were fairly scarred by that event. They had never experienced what it was like before to be judged that way. Some of them were better for it. Some of them were just still angry like that one afternoon framed their whole life. But she's relentless. She is relentless when she takes over the event. So now we're going to look at how race is constructed across the world. Now, in times before we had great global travel, we did not have much expansion. The concept of race already existed. We already had a concept of race before we had even knew there were people who didn't look like us. Race was constructed based on behavior. For example, the Romans, when they classified the Celts as a different race because they would chop off the heads of their enemies and nail them to the door. That made them a different race. So, in the Western world, and in Europe, and the United States, and well, Australia, we get these racial concepts that are fairly standardized. They base it on what you look like, and it's mostly from a colonial past, right? When Europe, particularly with England, would go and colonize a place, they were colonizing places fairly far away, so far away places that people look different from themselves, and they used that as a partial justification for why it was okay to colonize the place. So, as soon as Europeans start coming into contact with the rest of humanity, they decided, hey, we're better. So there was basically white Europeans on top, and then they organized people by shade. But there was also some exception, like white Europeans knew they owed a lot of their academic progress to the Greeks, right? Aristotle and those. And Greeks are not white people in the color of their skin. So then they were like, oh, maybe it's like facial structure too. So colonizers put themselves on top, and this, in a sense, was sort of the pattern that was perpetuated. Although I have to tell you that white people were not the first people to classify people based on skin. It was actually done first in the Middle East. Well, classify people based on skin, the Egyptians were first, but they didn't have any judgments associated with it. They just noticed because they actually had to travel far enough to see people who didn't look like them. And they were like, okay, people to the north are white, the people to the east are yellow, and they sort of put those general color terms on them. Then basically what is in now Saudi Arabia, this is the first time we get judgment based on skin, and that one's kind of interesting. The idea was that people were the color that they were based on how warm it was in their mother's womb while they were being baked. I sort of look at it like the bread theory. So if you were from Africa, it was too hot in your mother's womb, way too hot. So you would burn, and your hair was the hair type from bumping against your mom's womb, like bumping hair against a frying pan. If you were white, it was way too cold in your mom's womb, and that's why you're blonde with light skin. You're basically undone bread. You have not been fully cooked. And only they themselves, the Saudi Arabians, were the correct, because their color was not too brown. It was a red brown, like you would get on bread. And their hair was black, the appropriate color, but still straight. So it was warm enough to make perfect people. So they were first, but that didn't last long. And our culture teaches us to think of these distinctions, white, black, brown, as being real distinctions. Now, we're taught from a very early age, don't judge, don't hate, don't do that, but we still very much see these classifications as having justifiable bases. I grew up a long time more than you go. That came out totally not in English. I'm older than you are, and as a child of the 70s, I was told that race was only skin deep, and if you noticed anything that was different between people, you were a racist. That was a problem, right? Because I was definitely curious about people other than myself. I mean, I tell you, I was born an anthropologist. So I would go to my friends' houses, and I lived in an ethnically mixed neighborhood, and I'd go to my friends' houses, and I'd be like, why do you eat that? Because they ate different foods than I ate. My parents ate lots of vegetables, right? Vegetarian Andes, right? So I'd go to my friend's house where they were having like ham and collard greens. So good. By the way, I ate meat at every available opportunity. Anybody's house I go in, I was like, if I could smell chicken, I'd invite myself over. And my friends would be like, you can't ask that question. Well, why can't I ask that question? Well, because you're white and I'm not. Okay. I had a friend whose dad insisted that his name, well, he called himself Raj, but he insisted that he was a king from India, a fled king from India. And there I had curry for the first time, right? And I asked, oh, tell me about curry. And they said, you cannot ask this question. And I began to fear that I was actually a racist, like I talked about on television, because I noticed these things. That was too far. That, in a sense, we can't talk about race. We can't talk about ethnicity. We've actually we've given it too much power, and it forces people to polarize. You end up with people who've been told they're racist for so long they believe you. You don't want that. You want to be able to ask questions. Now, never are you responsible for responding for your whole race. I've had people ask me questions like, why do white people do this thing? You don't know they're all white people. You mean why did that guy do that thing, or do you mean why did you do that thing? That's the question. Ask that question. If you want to know, Dr. Gray, why do you put mustard on absolutely everything? I'll tell you, I come from German stock. All things should be made of sausages. And yes, vinegar is a major part of sauerkraut and mustard. And all things should be covered in mustard, because that's what's delicious. Now, is that because I'm white? No. It's because that's what I grew up eating. Well, at least when I got to eat somewhere that wasn't home. Right? Otherwise, if you ask me what's home cooking, I'm going to be like, well, there's sprouts, probably roasted eggplant, if it's a special day. Oh, God. None of my friends eat this way anymore, by the way. My mom actually called me yesterday and she was like, I want a steak. Okay. Now, I've actually gotten to see this firsthand. I decided that I wanted to. A couple summers ago, after having for so long had this friend from the Dominican Republic and wanted to know exactly what was going on, I went to the Dominican Republic. So it forms half of an island. In fact, the island of Hispaniola, which is where the term Hispanic comes from. I would say there's no Hispaniola. Well, it doesn't exist anymore, but half of it is Haiti, and half of it's the Dominican Republic. I'm interested in this island in particular because of religion and a bunch of other things. Basically, when the island was colonized, there was a French side and a Spanish side. The French side, Haiti. This is one of the sites of the only successful slave rebellion ever. Right? Fantastic history of the side. But the Caribbeans who were already there, so they imported slaves from Africa, and there were already existing Caribbean Indians there, and by Indian, indigenous. And they started dying off from the European diseases. There were some left, but mostly it was Africans that came in. So you ended up with this very rich biological diversity where you had African ancestry, European ancestry, and Caribbean ancestry. You say, how do all these ancestors happen? Well, you know, a mommy and a daddy love each other very much. You know, slave owners would have sex with whoever they pleased. Now, what happened to those kids in terms of what races they were? Well, some of that was determined by parentage. If dad was the white slave owner and mom was African or Korean, then you were mixed. And you probably weren't going to go to college or have a great life, but you were at least going to be taken care of. And reverse that. If mom was, let's say, the white daughter of the slave holder and she hooked up with an African or hooked up with a Caribbean, you were absolutely the lowest of the low. Right? So that was considered a problem. So in the current day Dominican Republic, when you ask people, they will absolutely tell you there's a strict hierarchy of races, and the way they see it is in shades, from light to dark. And the reason, in the Dominican Republic, the reason they say light is better is that light will have more of the Spanish ancestry, so more of the colonists, more of the slave owners, more of who had been elite in them. And the darker you are, the more of the folks who had been subjugated as in you, and that is considered negative. And they have all of these interesting ways of describing. You can be coffee, you can be chocolate, cinnamon, which Indio is not blue. And then rosy, you can be faded, blonde, dark, whatever, all the way to ashen. When I was there, I had a guide, because you always have the key informant, right? And the guide was, to me, he looked like he could be from anywhere in Mexico, just about. There was a little bit of indigenous in him. You could see a little bit of Indian in him. And his skin color, medium, kind of brown. Okay? Wasn't dark brown, wasn't light brown, just kind of brown. And I asked him where he fell in this, and he said, well, I'm lighter than most of my colleagues. And I looked around, and yeah, most of the people he worked with were darker than he was. He's like, so I'm of a higher status. Also, I am a supervisor at my job, which also makes me of a higher status. They did not use the term black. No one used the term black. No one. They only used these culturally appropriate terms. When I asked him about Haitians, who are, there were many more African origins. Most of the Caribs died off almost immediately in contact, so we don't have a lot of native individuals anymore. And it was skirmishes between the conquering slave population and the French pretty much kind of killed a lot of people who were involved. And they speak French in the Dominican Republic. They speak Spanish. In fact, you know, it's funny, I forgot that part. When I got off the plane, which was great, by the way, I highly recommend it. You get off the plane and you have to get off on the tarmac and walk into the airport. Like, you don't get off in an airport, you get off near the airport. And then if you go through customs at the airport, which you have to walk to, and the airport has a grass roof and no walls, so if you were like, I don't think I want to do this, you could walk over the fence and just walk over to your bag, but you probably don't want to do that because you kind of need the passport stamp to get back out. So, you know, but all of the instructions were in Spanish, and I hadn't even thought about it. Like, I was like, we're just going to the Dominican Republic. I don't know why I assumed there would at least be some instruction in English. Because American. Bad anthropologist, no cookie for you. And I was standing in line, and I was like, oh, okay, well, good thing I read Spanish. And suddenly my husband was like, wait, no one here speaks English? Because here's the funny thing, Mr. Multiracial, multi-ethnic, no Spanish. He speaks French and Japanese. The Japanese wasn't helping us. And there were no signs in French, even though Haiti, you could like throw a rock at Haiti from where we were. No signs in French. And so I was like, all right, ayúdame, por favor. Right? So when I started asking my informant about the Haitians, and I was like, hey, you know, because this was post the last earthquake, and I said, hey, you know, so tell me about Haiti. And he was like, oh, those people are animals. And I said, why are they animals? And he said, well, after the earthquake, we all went there. We ran. It was our neighbors, and our neighbors were in trouble. And we started helping them build their infrastructure. But they're too stupid to understand how to use it. And they just squandered the money we gave them because they are lazy, and because they don't know how to do things, and because they are stupid. And so I had to ask the question. I said, you mean because they are black? And he said, no, it's because they're Haitian. And I said, okay, what does that mean? He says, well, they speak French, and they're black. And I was like, that's exactly what I thought it was, right? Like, that's exactly, but I couldn't say that. I was like, okay, tell me more about that. So at the place where I was, because I decided that I couldn't conduct my research entirely from a resort, which I did a fine job of. At the resort I was at, there was staff that was very dark skinned. And I was like, so tell me about that employee or that person. And he'd say, oh, that person's Haitian. Do you know them? No. How do you know they're Haitian? Well, they're black. That person's Haitian, and that person's Haitian. And I started looking at it, and you could see whose job, who got what job, was actually based entirely on shade. The lighter you were, the more likely you were to have contact with guests. The darker you were, the less likely it was that you were going to have contact with guests, and the more likely you'd be cleaning rooms, doing gardening, all of that. It was very interesting, and everybody accepted it as so. So, of course, my husband ought to go talk to the groundskeepers because he could French, and the people were just like, yeah, the Dominicans are stuck up. So this is what it looks like. The last time I was there, I was, okay, first I have to find out where I was. San Cristobal. Who the heck was I? Okay, I landed here. I left from somewhere, but I landed here. No, I was here last. And while I was here, they were like, this is a good place to be. Be as far away from here as you can, because you know, they'll rape you. And they eat white people. And you know, after the earthquake, everyone's so poor. If you're driving with an open window in your car, they'll pull you out of your car like zombies. And yeah, it was this whole like, what are you talking about? In Malaysia, the racial structure they've got was set up by the British colonialists, and there's still a huge British colonial stamp through Malaysia. So basically, they took the Malay and they started them growing rice. And growing rice is actually a very effective way of growing food, because for every worker you put in, you can get 2 workers worth of food out. So it's one of those kind of neat, ever-expanding things. They took the local Chinese, they brought them in to work in the mines. So now we start having segregation based on where you come from. They took and brought native East Indians to work in the sugar mines, the sugar plantations, coffee, rubber, all that. Oh, and tea too. And then they were basically looking at it like, these people are good at this job. So if you're Chinese, you're automatically good at mining, right? If you're Malay, you're automatically good at farming rice. And well, we know the Indians have been handling tea, sugar, and coffee forever. And if you look at British tea now, they still describe it as from where in India it's from. And they thought of this as bringing in pre-trained workers. And the reason they thought of it as pre-trained is places where they already had colonial presences where the workers were trained to do that. They just brought them in to do the same thing. So after the Brits were not quite summarily removed, but slowly backed out, the native people, the Malay, were still at the bottom in their own country, right? Because this stratification had been in process for so long. So they were the majority. There were more of them than anyone else. And ultimately, we ended up with these rather significant riots, the last one being only as recent as 2005. Now, the situation's changing because globalization offers both opportunities and disasters. Because we have, trade is always an issue, but because they have the majority of the population, you'd think that they were going to come out the most ahead in globalization. They had a few things to get through. The first was this idea of this export processing zone. So there was this basically territorial buffer that was described as a free trade zone, and you couldn't. There was no taxes. You couldn't, if you bought something and you didn't pay taxes for it, if you took something out, you didn't pay taxes for it. That was quite attractive. Hong Kong tried something very similar. And then it brings, of course, international companies who are all like, no taxes, I'm here. And what was really interesting is because the people who were coming in didn't already have this social structure in mind, with Malays on the bottom, etc. They started employing the people who were there, including Malaysian women, where they were like, yeah, okay, we'll take employees where we can find it. So we ended up with this sort of combination of Malaysian women and Indian and Chinese men, and sort of this reduction of differences, if you will. Now, first we have to talk about us. Well, not first, last we'll talk about us. So when you look at the great melting pot of the United States, we've had many periods where we've discriminated on things other than skin. So after the potato famine, we have this great big Irish influx. Now, when we have Americans, they say things like, oh, I'm proud to be Irish, and proud, We have Irish culture festivals. Every March 17th, we get together, drink good beer, and all pretend we're Irish, and it's all a good thing. Well, there was a time in our history where it was not a good thing. We still have some terms that come from this that are not so pleasant. Like, we still call it a paddy wagon for the cops, when they throw everybody in that back of that big van, we go through the paddy wagon. Paddy, Patrick. It's a patty wagon. It's where we put the drunk Patricks. I as in the drunk Irish Patricks. Right, so, they saw the Irish as a lower class. This happens, this idea, by the way, this idea of what it means to be Irish is actually entirely American. Go to Ireland. It is green there, but it's inherently green. No green beer, leprechauns, or all that other bullshit that we're like, yeah, I'm proud to be Irish. It's basically what we would consider an imagined community. Here, we have what we call an imagined community. So, after the Irish, it was not good to be Russian. It was not good. I mean, there's been one after the other. But I will tell you that there was a time when being Irish meant you weren't white. That is, you weren't white, you were definitely the lower class. Eventually, though, part of the way that changed was the Irish started taking on jobs, particularly in New York, which was the origin space they landed in, that were jobs with authority but didn't require an education. They became our police officers. They became our firefighters. Right, there's a proud tradition of police officers and firefighters. But afterwards, if you want to read more about it, you can read like Slaughterhouse-Five. Oh God, just heart-wrenching kinds of ways that race was constructed in the U.S. So if we look at racism itself, we have to say, okay, it's a fairly complex system of power that's entirely culturally constructed. How we decide who's white and who's not, or who's desirable and who isn't, is entirely culturally constructed. It has nothing to do with biology. It has nothing to do with actually how you're phenotypically represented. It has everything to do with the culture says means about it. And while I say this is all very dumb, I can't argue with you that it isn't real. That people do not have differently allocated resources based on these arbitrary conditions. They do not have the same access to resources. They do not have the same access to power. They do not have the same kind of privilege across the board, even though really all we're talking about is your ability to withstand sunlight. So we have different types of racism. So individual racism is basically, when you think of racism, this is typically what you're thinking of, individual racism. Or somebody says, oh, I don't like those brown people, right? I don't like Mexicans. That would be a socially perceived race, even though we're actually talking about a nationality there, right? Or I don't like Jews. Okay, we're talking about a religion, but it's socially perceived race, right? So we say those things, and we get the idea that that's racism. Well, that is racism, but it's what we call individual racism. It can be active. I won't hire no Jews. Or it can be passive. Maybe there are two people in front of me, I make a choice, and secretly I'm making the choice based on what I think the religion means and associate it with race. So it can be unintentional or intentional. And we've talked about individual racism quite a bit. Institutional racism is something a little bit different. It's essentially institutionalized structure that perpetuates and exists where racism is there. These would be, the Jim Crow laws are a fine example of institutionalized racism, where there is specific policy that is different from race to race. So this was most of you already know this. I can't imagine there's anyone in this room who doesn't know this, but particularly in the American South, if you were black, you couldn't drink at the same drinking fountain. You couldn't, if you were on the bus, you had to move if a white person wanted a seat. And the idea was it was supposed to be separate but equal. Why the hell it had to be separate was because people felt that they didn't want the other race near them. If you want to watch some examples of that, The Help was a fine movie on that. Just getting an idea of what it looked like from within. My father's father married 4 times, and the last 2 wives were African-American women. The first one was named Lily, and she was a large woman and a nurse, and I loved her. But she died by the time I was 1, and then was replaced by Essie, and Essie was my black grandmother. And Essie, she passed away about, I guess it's been 3 years now. I still miss her. She was an Italian lady. She was my favorite grandma. She knew all of her grandma stuff to do. Like, she actually baked cookies, like a grandma's supposed to. But she used to tell me about what it was like, because she was old enough to know what it was like to have white only lunchtowns. And she was a nurse, and she had to deal with Jim Crow as a nurse. So here she was, a qualified professional, but she couldn't drink at the same drinking fountain as her patients or her other fellow coworkers. In fact, in some cases, it was very difficult to hire because they wanted to have separate wings in hospitals and things like that. But I will tell you, she was a tough old broad. She had no filter. It might be where I get it, but it's also because she was older, and within the African American community, an older woman has a ton of authority. A ton. You would never dream of saying no to your grandmother for anything. And she could still hit me when I was 40, and I wouldn't have said anything. It would have been like, if she whacked me across the face, I would have been like, I'm sorry. Because, yeah. And that's some very funny stories I could tell you, but we don't have enough time. So, in order for racism to be there, there has to be racial ideology. There has to be, in this case, it would be institutionalized ideology. There have to be generally agreed upon popular ideas. So this comes back to the idea of white man can't jump, or white men don't dance, or black men make better athletes, or some of the things we were talking about on Monday, right? And while we think those are funny, you have to recognize those are not so far off from the Jim Crow laws and from the other ways that we use to socially agree what it meant to be a certain race. When we socially agree on that, we start having these ideologies that sort of flow through our culture, and we act on them. And as long as we do that, we're going to have a hard time. We're going to struggle with racism. It's not going to get any better. There's more to this. I definitely want you to read the white privilege study, there's a little box in your book. But I want to break up now for a second. I would like you to get into groups of 5 and discuss your findings with each other. Remember the things you brought